We would like to say welcome to everyone. Happy Thursday. This is our first in a series of webinars entitled Partners in Philanthropy, the Legacy of Black Communities in Rosenwald Schools. Part one, the focus of part one will be philanthropy and community uplift, a shared faith and cultural traditions in the Black and Jewish communities. So, if some of you all were on back in April, that was the springboard event to this webinar series when we celebrated Dr. Booker T. Washington's birthday. So we hope that you will be very informed from this presentation and join us for the next three. At this time, I'm going to turn it over to my mother, Muriel Miller Branch, who is the founder and current president of AMMD Pine Grove Project, and she will introduce our moderator for the evening.
Good evening, and ditto to what Sonia has said. We welcome you, and we're so happy you could join us for this really what is our second in a series of webinars, which will elevate the story of partnerships forged by and investments made by Black citizens in communities throughout the South in establishing and sustaining the Rosenwald schools. Tonight, it is my esteemed honor to introduce my friend and community powerhouse, Dr. Carmen F. Foster. And I'm going to read this brief bio that she sent me with threats to break my arm. No, I'm just kidding. If I lengthened it, made it any longer. Carmen F. Foster, public historian and project consultant, teachers in the movement, the University of Virginia. Dr. Carmen Foster, the daughter of Richmond's premier Black Richmond historian, Dr. Frances Foster, couples her lens as a public historian with expertise in organizational leadership, team development, and facilitation as a consultant and a coach for senior executives and next generation leaders. We like that. She earned her doctorate in education from the University of Virginia and holds a master's in public administration from Harvard University. As an educational historian, her research has examined the experiences of Richmond's African American community during desegregation in the early 1960s. As a child of the civil rights movement, she was one of the first wave of students to desegregate the Richmond public schools. Carmen's tagline is knowledge, insight, and wisdom. Carmen, take it away. Unmute.
Okay, I'm unmuted. Thank you so much. That was a very generous introduction. I'm really excited to be here, and I'm pleased because I've really been following what's been going on with this wonderful project at Pine Grove for so long. And it takes leadership. It takes a committed sense of collective enterprise for people to do together something that's special to honor the legacy, not only of Pine Grove, but to represent all the wonderful schools that represent the Rosenwald schools. You know, I'm excited to introduce you to our two outstanding panelists, Rabbi Dennis Beck-Berman, and also the Reverend Dr. Faith Harris. Let me tell you a bit about each. Rabbi Beck-Berman serves as the spiritual leader for Congregation Brith Achim in Petersburg. He's a graduate of Haverford College, and he's done additional studies at Hebrew University, Parties Institute, and graduate studies at the University of Pennsylvania. He's provided extensive leadership to serve a variety of interfaith and education-oriented nonprofit boards. He served as a military chaplain, and he's lectured and provided training locally, nationally, and as well as in Israel and Europe. The Reverend Dr. Faith B. Harris serves as an assistant professor of theological studies at Virginia Union's Samuel DeWitt Proctor School of Theology, where she earned her doctorate and her master's of divinity. She also holds a master's of sacred theology from Boston University School of Theology. Dr. Harris is a member of First Unitarian Church in Richmond. She is a proud womanist and a community activist. She's passionate about community organizing, public speaking, and teaching as she serves universities, our communities, and the church. Like Rabbi Beck-Berman, she's involved in interfaith organizations and leadership with a range of nonprofits to support social justice and community action. Each of our panelists will provide a 10 to 15-minute presentation based on our themes of partnering and philanthropy, as we lift up the legacy of Black communities and the Rosenwald schools. But before we begin, we have a brief video that I think is absolutely fabulous. I'm so glad that Muriel found it for us. It was produced by CBS News, and it provides a rich context of the history of Black education and the impact made by the development of the Rosenwald schools. It's a great context for our discussion, and it highlights the legacy and the restoration of schools like Pine Grove. So I'm going to share my, let's see, I think you can see a screen of sorts. It's black right now, but let me get started. You will hear some tunes at first from Aretha Franklin. I'm not pushing my Spotify button, but this will make it fun.
They were called Rosenwald schools. Built between 1912 and 1937, they provided an opportunity for hundreds of thousands of poor African Americans to be educated in the segregated South. In fact, their construction has been called one of the most effective philanthropic endeavors of the 20th.
Oh, sorry.
Largely unknown today. We traveled to Georgia last week to learn about the past and the impact of these institutions and what they're still having on us today. From above, it seems ordinary, a simple white house an hour northwest of Atlanta. But when the Noble Hill School was constructed nearly 100 years ago, it was revolutionary.
This was my school. Before the Civil War, we weren't even allowed to be taught.
Marion Coleman and 4 generations of her family were educated here, one of thousands of schoolhouses built over 3 decades that transformed African American education in the rural South.
We weren't really free to do or to think that we could accomplish more. But when we were able to get the school, and this just made the foundation so that we could really believe in ourselves, and the teachers helped us to know that we were able to move forward now.
They became known as Rosenwald schools, named after wealthy industrialist Julius Rosenwald, the president of retail giant Sears.
This is an important Southern story. This is an important American story. This story transforms America.
Photographer Andrew Filer is telling that story in black and white. A story that grew out of a friendship between Rosenwald, the son of Jewish immigrants, and noted educator Booker T. Washington, founding president of the Tuskegee Institute.
From Tuskegee, the institute which he founded.
Together, they sought to reverse years of inequality in education because of slavery and segregation.
This story are the pillars of my life. The relationship between Julius Rosenwald and Booker T. Washington is the foundation of the Black-Jewish alliance that becomes a pillar of the civil rights movement.
In 1912, they launched a pilot program, building 6 schools in Alabama, requiring local communities to donate the land and raise matching funds. What were they trying to defeat?
Schools started off as being segregated. They were trying to get through that part.
What does that do to a child?
Well, to me, that would dishearten them and give them make them feel like they didn't matter.
Within 25 years, 4,978 schools were built across 15 states. Buildings of basic design, 2 rooms with a removable partition, large windows to let in light, and a plain exterior to avoid unwanted attention.
These little schools had such a profound impact. Can you put it into words?
There are economists at the Federal Reserve Bank that have done 5 studies of Rosenwald schools. And what their analysis shows is that prior to World War I, there was a large and persistent black-white education gap in the South. That gap closes precipitously between World War I and World War II. And the single greatest driver of that achievement, and it is an achievement, is Rosenwald schools.
I think of our educational system today. I wonder what could be learned from a deeper dive into the Rosenwald history.
We often think that problems in America, public policy problems in America, are so intractable, particularly those related to race. At the center of this story is Julius Rosenwald and Booker T. Washington reaching across divides of race, religion, and region, partnering with black communities and white school boards to fundamentally change America.
Only about 500 schools remain, relics of a time before legal segregation ended in 1954. Some have been repurposed or rebuilt, but many are in disrepair, forgotten by the communities they served. Filer spent 3.5 years documenting them. His photographs are on display at the National Center for Civil and Human Rights in Atlanta, an effort to help preserve their legacy.
Why don't we know this?
Julius Rosenwald is a very modest man. He did not name these schools Rosenwald schools. They become known as Rosenwald schools. One of the reasons why we don't know the Rosenwald name as much as we know the names of some of his philanthropic contemporaries like Carnegie, Rockefeller, Ford.
They were monument builders.
They were.
He was a legacy builder.
Yes.
That legacy is still being felt. Many of those educated at Rosenwald schools went on to higher education and in turn educated future generations. And prominent leaders of the civil rights movement like Medgar Evers, Maya Angelou, and Congressman John Lewis came through these institutions. Today, Noble Hill is a museum run by Marion's niece, Valerie. Generations removed from the school, but steeped in its history.
It's not just African American history to us, it's also American history. This is not just a job for me, this is legacy.
It is such an amazing place to go and to see how a community has so embraced or re-embraced this school. I knew nothing about these schools.
Makes me want to visit Noble Hill.
I know. But there is a book that that Filer put together, A Better Life for Their Children, the foreword written by John Lewis.
Oh, wow.
So I apologize. I think that part of it you weren't able to see. But trust me, if you go to Rosenwald School, CBS News, if you want to see it again, it's there for you. But I think that gives you a great opportunity to understand more about how important Rosenwald schools were. Rabbi Beck-Berman, you have the virtual floor now. What can you tell us as we talk about our themes of partnering and philanthropy as we look at the legacy of Black communities in the Rosenwald schools? The floor is yours.
Well, I think one issue is the fact that many people don't really think in terms of all of us being us. They see the world with blinders that only allow in their particular ethnic, religious group. I recall talking to a 3-star general once about a Holocaust program. And he said, well, Rabbi, why would I need to be at a Holocaust program? I mean, it's a Jewish thing. And I said, well, sir, I think for the most part, Jews know about the Holocaust, but wasn't it Christians that did the killing of 6 million Jews? I mean, wouldn't that be something beyond the Jewish community? And he would have none of it. And that kind of attitude is rampant through the whole world. I mean, people grow up with biases that they may be even unaware of. These are things that are learned. I remember once a Hillel director at Yale told me a story about how his little first grader, kindergartner, had come home and said, I think I'm going to get a call from my new girlfriend. Thrills. The little girl calls, and mother answers and says, oh, let's listen. So the little girl says, I'd like to have you come over and play at my house. We can go in the swimming pool. And the little boy says, that's great. She says, let me ask my mommy. Mom says, sure, I'll take you over. And she says, well, let me ask my mommy. She comes back and says, mommy says we don't let Jews come to our house. At that point, the parents were going, oh my God, our child will be scarred forever. But what happened was interesting. His reaction was, what's wrong with your mommy? And the little girl says, I don't know what's wrong with my mommy. Let me go and ask mommy. Her reaction is priceless. It's a proof positive that people don't get born with prejudices. They learn them from peers, from parents, from society at large. And this is, I think, the biggest problem we faced, in that Mr. Sachs from Goldman Sachs would come to Chicago and meet with Julius Rosenwald, and they discussed the problems, the social issues in America, and they decided that the biggest issue facing America is the problem of the African-American community, how they were being forced out of being an essential part of America when they represented a huge community. This is still with us, this legacy. The philanthropic impulse that, people are amazed. Why did Rosenwald do all that? He did a lot more than just make Rosenwald schools too for the Black community. There were college programs and all kinds of other things he was involved with. And he had set aside, about $30 million back then, which would be almost like $500 million in current money. So why did he do it? There are religious and cultural reasons why Jews give so much. Studies have been done in terms of Jewish philanthropy in America, and usually they conclude that Jews give well above their proportional thing in terms of other religious groups and so on. What pushes this? Well, if you go back to the first century, there was a little community in a place called Ed.D, which had a queen who had a house in Jerusalem. They converted to Judaism. And so Monobazus, her son, was the king in the first century, and there were all kinds of famines at that point going through Israel, and the Jews in Palestine were starving, and he gave away almost their entire fortune. There's a story in the Talmud that says the relative said, "Why are you squandering away our inheritance? Why are you giving it away like that?" He said, "You don't seem to understand. Your idea of his inheritance is a whole bunch of money in a vault. That's not a great inheritance. I'm building my inheritance in heaven. Your inheritance it could be destroyed, could be taken, could be seized, who knows what. Mine is guaranteed." And this attitude from 2,000 years ago indicates that there were plenty of people that didn't think you should be giving everything away. What do you think you're doing? But Rosenwald, like Monobazus, had a uniquely Jewish view that God doesn't want you to go to the next world with all your money. You can't take it with you. And so this is one of the factors. But there is something called tzedakah, which means righteousness, justice. And in Jewish tradition, giving to another is not an act of charity. You're not handing it out. Ultimately, you don't own the money. God owns the money. By grace of God, you have your money. By the grace of God, you can have it taken away. And someday you're going to die and you can't take it with you. So realizing that you're entrusted with wealth and you're supposed to be doing something important with it. And there's another side to that called tikkun olam, repairing, restoring the world. So if you, in the Talmud, there's a number of cases where laws by the rabbis were decided on this particular idea. For example, it says, a person has to give charity to Jews and non-Jews without any discrimination for the sake of world peace. And then they say, and if you have people that want to, well, if you remember the story of Ruth in the Bible, she goes out to the field of Boaz and they tell him who it is. It's a relative. She's with Naomi, whom he knows, whom he grew up with. And he says to the guys in charge, I don't want a single man to molest this woman. Don't you dare touch her. A fast answer to me. And he turns to the women. He says, and make sure when you're harvesting the tithes, drop a lot in front of her so she can pick it up and then take it legally back home as part of the Jewish law, biblical law of tithe. And when she comes home, Naomi says, oh my God, where did you go? How did you get so much stuff? She says, well, I went to, our friend Boaz, and the girls were just dropping stuff all over in front of me. I got a lot. This is how you do tzedakah. You don't give it as a handout. Someone needs to feel like they're doing it themselves. And that's a basic law enshrined by the great 10th century Jewish scholar Maimonides. He says the highest form of charity is to enable someone to support themselves. No handouts, nothing like it. Give them a job, give them an education, and let them earn it. And so I would say that's the basic Jewish attitude. And those are the basic concepts in terms of Jewish philanthropy. Okay. I think you're still muted.
Okay, there we go. Thank you, sir.
Okay.
I really appreciate what you had to say, particularly when you talked about, is it Tukum Olam? Because, that's to fix or repair the world. And I think it is very powerful that you also talked about tzedakah, which means justice. And so it really is if social welfare is an economic and a social justice matter for that. Dr. Harris, we're interested in what you have to share. Please join us in the conversation.
Thank you. And thank you, Rabbi Berman. I really appreciate your comments. My comments are a little bit more formal because I wanted to read from a couple of quotes and something that I wrote earlier this year. And I want to frame my comments in the idea of the Black freedom struggle, and as it relates to the idea of freedom generally. And so the first quote comes from the book written by Tisa Wagner. It is about, the title is Religious Freedom, the Contested History of the American Ideal. And she quotes there from President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a statement of, he made this statement of 4 freedoms. These are the freedoms that he said that Americans would go to war in order to defend. And the first is the freedom of speech, the freedom of worship, the freedom from want, and the freedom from fear. And when I think of these freedoms, they really amount to, in many ways, for me, the idea of what it means to be human and having human dignity. And so to demand this freedom was also a claim, she says, is also to claim an interiority and of experience, to define oneself as a human subject, one with a soul and spirit and a concern for the eternal. And so when we, particularly at this time when we're thinking of the situation of many of the Rosenwald schools, as well as we're in the context of getting ready to go into the second year where we're celebrating as a nation, or beginning to think about the idea of Juneteenth, emancipation, freedom, and liberation for people. There's no better road or medium or way to freedom than through being educated and having one's mind freed from the shackles of ignorance and being segregated from the possibilities and all of the opportunities that are in this world given to all of us by the Creator, our God, or the Eternal One. And so African Americans who were enslaved in this country, justified by Christians and displaced from their lands, culture, religions, and ancestors, have a unique and fierce historical commitment to the ideals of freedom. With their very presence in the New World, Africans have a unique claim to religious freedom and freedom, period, despite the rhetoric embedded in our Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. Indeed, Black religion and African Americans is best expressed in Black religion and among Black folk. That by embracing relationship to freedom and a freedom-loving God, theologian Kelly Brown Douglas argues that in the Black theological imagination, God is free, and to be in relationship with God is to be free. So if one wishes to take the unique relationship African Americans have to religious freedom or to freedom in America seriously, then one must understand this critical contextual background in developing fresh perspectives on freedom and religious freedom, and what does it mean to be human in this context. African Americans have also contributed to the complex narrative of freedom in this, from the earliest stages of Black African enslavement by European Christians. They have critiqued, they have challenged, they have condemned the morality and the veracity of the enslavers' religion, as well as American Christian rhetoric of freedom. Enslaved and free Africans and African Americans like Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, David Walker, Oluwatoyin Equiano, Frederick Douglass, Fannie Lou Hamer, Ella Baker, Martin Luther King Jr., John Lewis, Booker T. Washington, and many others who escaped from the shackles of slavery, rebelled against American slaveocracy, boycotted, sang, resisted, prayed, preached, worked, wrote, taught, and died, bearing witness to the constitutive nature of African Americans' contributions to the discourse and reality of religious freedom. It is not only African American Christians, but also Jews and Muslims, Buddhists, Baha'is, agnostics, atheists, and others who affirm the right and dignity to be free. And that being one of the most important values and ideals when we think of, in the context of the importance of educating the mind and freeing the mind. And so finally, African Americans are consequential in the discourse on freedom, the narrative of freedom that we constantly hear drummed in our nation. We can't forget the role that persons on the margins, whether religious or for religious reasons, or whether for because they had been enslaved, because they had come from the continent of Africa, because their skin was of a darker hue. As freedom-loving people, African Americans have been at the forefront in creating an expansive vision and a space for new voices, ideas, and practices of religious freedom and freedom generally. African Americans' unique relationship to this discourse of freedom is as persons emancipated in body and faith from the racial scale of salvific possibilities and its political, physical, and religious enslavement. African Americans' very struggle for freedom is the source and model for many peoples around the world to exercise their right to dignity and freedom. This expansion includes all peoples, cultures, faiths, traditions, and beliefs, and includes all of life. And even the work that I do as an ecologist and as an environmentalist, the Christian colonizing enterprise not only reorganized peoples on a religious scale, but it also reoriented peoples away from their environment, shaped by a human-centric hierarchy of moral values, reducing Black and brown bodies to commodity and land, also to only commodity, plants as commodity, animals as commodity, and only as capital property. And the climate of our day, the climate that we're living in right now, we talk about it as a climate crisis, but it is also, it's a freedom crisis, not only for the peoples who live on the earth, but also for the earth itself. And so when we talk about the idea of, even when we talk about the idea of philanthropy, we must first understand the dignity, what it means to be free and what it means to have human dignity, because philanthropy, in my opinion, is a direct result. It is not possible without freedom. In order to give and to share and to be able to be generous, one must be in some level, have some level of a sense of their own dignity, a sense of their own purpose, their own relationship to a God who is both free, generous, and also loving. And so I think when we begin to even think about framing this discussion, we must start with the idea of what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be part of this long history of struggle for freedom, not just for African people? And I hope Juneteenth will remind us all to think about not just for African peoples, but for all peoples and for even our earth. Like, what does it mean to ascribe dignity, the life, and to the lives, to all that's living on the planet? And so these ideals of freedom are directly related to the ideal of philanthropy, brotherhood, sisterhood, and developing out what these Rosenwald schools clearly did by creating community, creating legacy, creating space and place and location for acting out, implementing the quest for freedom, for Black people, and for and actually, in many ways, for the Jewish people themselves, because recognizing that even in this context, that there is, there is anti-Semitism, right? There is, while we might be able to say there might be levels of it, but in reality, there is a impulse in our country that has, in our world, really, that has maintained keeping certain folk on the margins, and not really allowing them to fully be live out their human dignity. So that's the context in which I think when I talk about philanthropy, because so much of what people think of when they think of philanthropy is really about money and having funds and financials to be able to share, but really sharing the wealth of this world it begins there. You're muted.
Okay, thank you again, Dr. Harrison. Thank you again, Rabbi Beck-Berman. There's a good question that has come from our panelists in terms of how does our shared experience of oppression inform the success of community uplift? And as we think about community uplift, I'm also interested in how we might expand the idea of dignity, as you've described it, as it relates to school building and community building.
Well, as I said, if one is in darkness in the mind, right, and is unable to access knowledge, access understanding, access wisdom, their freedom, their dignity as a human being, their ability to fully live out their capacity that is God-given is not possible. And that was probably one of the most despicable parts of the enslavement and Jim Crow era. And so in many ways, the Rosenwald schools provided that opportunity for people, for Black folk in small communities who had no access because of segregation, because of Jim Crow laws, because of policies, governmental and communal and religious policies. And that's why I couch this in recognizing that this is a unique experience. And I appreciate what Rabbi Berman mentioned. The Holocaust was perpetrated by Christians. Many of and so was enslavement. Don't forget that it started in Rome. It started out of papal bull, right? It was not just something people did on their own. The church gave its justification for it. And so until we understand that, we can't really understand what it means to fully be free. So freedom starts with the mind, with understanding that God. I love the quote that I read from Kelly Brown Douglas, that freedom-loving people they love freedom because they love a God who is free and who wishes and desires freedom for all of God's creation. So
thank you. Rabbi Beck-Berman, can you add to that as we talk about how does our shared experience of oppression inform the success for community uplift?
Well, all oppressed peoples around the world have often turned to the Bible, looked at the story of the Egyptian slavery of the Israelites and their journey of freedom to the promised land. The rabbis commenting on the story say, it says in the Bible, the word of God was charut al luchot. It was engraved upon the tablets. They said, don't read it as charut because the Bible is written without vowels in it. But read it as cherut, freedom. It says there is no freedom without Torah. What they meant is that if the Israelites had simply gone free and God had just taken them to the promised land, there would never have been freedom. Freedom requires education. They had to go to Mount Sinai and get from God values and commandments to live by, and have the intelligence to interpret them and update them and whatever. And so you don't ever get to the promised land as a free person if you haven't first been able to have an education and think for yourself, develop critical thinking. And if you look around America right now, critical thinking is a very short supply. My wife teaches at Virginia State University, and what does she teach? Critical thinking. But it's something people need. It's something that should be taught all over, but woefully, you don't find too much critical thinking in media or in common parlance. That's a sad thing. And you can't have freedom if people are going to think there's Jewish space lasers. What kind of freedom are we going to have? I mean, it's crazy. So
that's significant. When you talk about freedom and education, it also makes me consider how enslaved people were not able to learn how to read and write. It was verboten. And in the same point, I think about Kristallnacht and the burning of books and how the destruction of knowledge is really antithetical to freedom. And also the struggle toward what you each talked about before in terms of human dignity and how important that is. To have a sense of dignity. Philanthropy is not just giving your money away, it is helping somebody to have a hand up. And when I think about Booker T. Washington and how while he talked about more or less casting your buckets where you are, it was his way during that time in that era, as Jim Crow was encroaching, to encourage people to have a sense of dignity, the value of worth, the value of work. I am really struck by the similarities between the journey that that Jewish people have taken under oppression, as well as African Americans. But I'm also struck by the sense of collectivism that seems to be embedded in each of the cultures. And that sense of collectivism is very different from the John Wayne American individualism ideal. So speak to how that sense of cultural collectivism for each of the cultural communities and faith communities that you represent really embraces that sense of uplift, education, and freedom.
So, if it's okay, I'll go first.
Okay.
One of the thoughts that I had, the question that you asked is really an important question. And as you know, I teach theology, and one of the I really appreciate Rabbi Beck-Berman's statement about critical thinking, because even in the classroom, in the systematic theology class, that's my greatest challenge is to encourage people preparing to be clergy, to be ministers, to be the wise one in the midst, to think critically about their faith, think critically about how they acquired their faith, to think critically about what does their faith mean in the context of the larger, national narrative. And so I think it's incredibly important to recognize that when we think about the idea of collective, the similarities in recognizing community, right, and interconnectedness and relationship, being part of, there being some parallels between Judaism and the way that you see African Americans approach their faith tradition. I think it comes from the same place in many ways, and sometimes it's more caught than understood. Like it's more intuitive because being pressed into small communities, segregated from opportunity and access to the the larger society. You could say that's part of the reason, but I think the other part of it is that there is a religious ethic and value that has been handed down and that has been taught to us, that we've shared. I know I received that from my mother and my grandmother and my grandfather, that that it wasn't acceptable to achieve in life without thinking about how you were sharing and helping someone else, right? So there was just no way that you can have a life that's good and call yourself, being a good person without sharing what you have with those around you, and particularly those who are in need, not only financial need, but who are in need of mentoring, who are in need of a word of encouragement, who are in need of whatever. So that, I think that is, those shared values come out of our traditions, particularly, when you look at the story of creation, the story of the children of Israel leaving Egypt, and what they had to do to create a society and a civilization, that there was no way that they could survive without some recognizing the importance of relationship and interdependence and interconnectedness, not only with other people, but with the earth, right? You have to understand all of that.
Dr. Harris, I know that Rabbi Beck-Berman also has a time factor.
Yes.
Yeah, I want about 2 minutes, 3 minutes.
Yes. So I want you to please feel free to respond so that you can add to the comments, because I think that what Dr. Harris has said so far is a great segue to looking at it through a Jewish lens.
And I would like to respond by beginning not but and. And I agree with what you said. And I would say that Heschel was correct when he said that ultimately in the Hebrew Bible, the key thing is empathy. And inculcating empathy in human beings is not easy. One of my good friends is a Methodist minister, and he told me of an incident that happened when he was at Princeton Theological Seminary. On his way to class, there was only one stairway you could use to get there, and there was this homeless guy, smelled, looked horrible, and you had to go right past him. He was groaning, "Help me, someone please help me." And he and a few others stopped to say, "What can I do for you? All right?" Most of them just zipped past to get to class on time. So the professor walks in, he hands out the exam. He says, "Before we begin, question number 4. If you'll turn to the page, is blank. The answer to question number 4, the right answer is going to be my friend here." And the homeless guy walks in. He says, "Who stopped to help you?" Him, her, him, and he says, "All right, you passed that question." This was the question on Jesus's parable of the Good Samaritan. Obviously, you folks got it. The rest of you failed on that question. And he never forgot that story, because it was a very good way to teach religion. It's not what you have in your head that matters. It's what's in your heart and in your deeds. And Jesus tried to make that clear as a good rabbi. And a lot of these students just went right over. And this is going to be ultimately all that will make a difference in the world. is going through the world trying to be compassionate, empathetic to other human beings. And the extent that we can do that, we're good. Let me close with something that happened. I would have, in Petersburg, I would have guys knock on my door. They want to make some money. Can I do anything for you, sir? I said, well, I didn't really have anything, but I said, are you hungry? He said, yeah. I said, would you like something to eat? He said, yeah. I said, come around the back. I got something for you. I made him a peanut butter and jelly sandwich with some cheese and a soda and some chips. And he said, I never had peanut butter, jelly, and cheese. I said, it's got more protein. Try it. You'll like it. He goes, oh, that's good. So he liked it. And he would come regularly. And one time I wasn't there. Knocks on the door. And my younger daughter answers. And he says, is your dad there? He says, no. He said, well, he usually gets me something to eat. He says, okay, come around back. He says, what does he usually get you? Peanut butter, jelly, and cheese with chips and a soda. And she said, okay. And says, Dad, I was a little worried because I didn't know this guy. And like, I felt a little awkward, you know, but he seemed to know you and know that you were expecting to feed him this. So I figured I better do it. I said, you did the right thing, honey. Educating our children not to be afraid of an African-American man, which in this country seems to be, we're woefully behind in that. Our score is about like 2 out of 100. People just get terrified at an African-American man. I don't know why that is. But I mean, there's a lot of reasons for it, but they're excuses, not reasons. So I think that's really going to make the real difference in terms of going from here. And there are so many anecdotes of what's been happening in the last year or two. I just want to, as a rabbi, say, praise you, Lord our God, ruler of the universe, who has granted an open-heartedness and an awareness of reality to the Congress of the United States, that without screaming and yelling and without making all kinds of terrible excuses, they voted to make Juneteenth a federal holiday. And we have a president who happily signed it into law. So we're at a place of greater empathy and awareness just in that happening. I don't expect intelligence to break out in Congress anytime soon. We have a lot of people who don't believe that the president is real, and then another guy is going to just kind of be installed in the middle of July. But, you know, and they believe in all kinds of other wacko, anti-Semitic, anti-Black, anti-ethnic, ever you name it. But may the good Lord open their minds and hearts to a wider notion of reality than they have now. With that, I'm going to have to say farewell.
Sure. Thank you, Rabbi.
Okay.
Great word. Thank you so much for being here.
Okay, glad I could join you. Okay, let me see.
Continue the conversation. Thank you for your insights.
Okay.
Giving us some real, take care.
Okay.
It's given us some real insight to understand some of the commonalities between the Jewish faith and, you know, our African-American heritage and Christian faith. And in ways where we can see a sense of collectivism, a sense of purposefulness that is really important. I think about the fact that during the, you know, after Reconstruction with colored women's clubs, the early women's movement had as their motto, lifting as we climb. And they were talking about not just reaching outward to the young folks, but to everyone, so that everyone succeeds, because all of us are focused on that success. If you have any questions that you'd like to ask the panelists, please go right ahead and go to the Q&A and offer your questions while we continue for a few moments longer our discussion while we have Dr. Faith Harris, and also as we have Muriel Miller-Branch, who's been involved with Pine Grove. One thing that I think is fascinating as this topic comes up for us to look at Black philanthropy is Emmett Carlson, who is a Morehouse grad. He worked at the Ford Foundation and has done other stints as a CEO for several community foundations across the country. You know, he's looked as a scholar at Black philanthropy in as a three-stranded braid: self-help, humanitarian aid, and social change. And when I think about the building of the Rosenwald schools, for those Black communities that were involved in helping to make the Rosenwald schools succeed. That self-help was not only self-help alone, but it was a blend of this charitable impulse that provided political, social, and economic activism within those communities, as well as an emphasis on education, knowing that that would be connected to enabling that community to regain its sense of humanity. And through that, there would be social change. You know, I've been fascinated looking at the Rosenwald story as a way where we also see the social capital that Black teachers and students were able to develop with a thriving, vibrant academic life. Even though the buildings may be meager, they may be clearly not as fancy as the comparable white schools by any means. But when you talk about richness, the social capital was there in that community, where you saw a sense of interpersonal connectedness, you saw institutional caring, robust parent involvement, because many times parents would be the ones to help ensure that those schools would get built through their own labor after they finished their jobs. They would be there to make sure that everybody who was connected to doing anything, whether it was putting nails in the building or whether it was making sure everybody had a drink of water or some lunch. That sense of community support was about what Black education was then for ourselves, because teachers were not just teachers. They were counselors, they were encouragers, they were racial cheerleaders for the children and for those families and communities. You know, there is a professor at Emory, Vanessa Siddle Walker, who's written a wonderful book called To Their Highest Potential that talks about Caswell County in North Carolina and has really expanded the notion of what is now called valued segregated schools. So when people think about Rosenwald schools or schools during the Jim Crow era, you can think about the fact that they were not what people like to think about as Black education as dilapidated, parents don't care, they don't participate. Some would even argue that integration, you know, led to some of what we see now. But in the past, you know, the Rosenwald schools and all the schools during segregation had something vibrant that is part of philanthropy, which is time, treasure, and talent. So all of that comes into place when you think about that. And when Julius Rosenwald contributed the money that he did in partnership, some people might say, well, why didn't he give it all? But he knew that their talent was there. The ambition, the drive, the thirst for learning was there. And if people as stakeholders help to own it, then it will succeed. So Pine Grove is just one of many Rosenwald schools. I think there are about 5,000 or so. And not all of them are remaining, but for those that remain, it's more than just the building, it's the legacy that is represented for those schools. And when those communities, like the ones in Pine Grove and other places, you can see that that's a reminder of the values that must continue within the Black community, the values that interestingly are similar values to the Jewish community in terms of their sense of collectivism and how their faith teaches them that all of us have to look out for each other. So as I just shared that, I'm curious about what else Dr. Harris or Muriel Miller Branch might have to talk about the importance of philanthropy, whether it was Rosenwald's philanthropy, Black philanthropy, and the quality of character that goes beyond anything you could put on a financial spreadsheet.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
I'd like to say this is exactly why we're having these webinars. We want to redefine some things. And philanthropy is one of those things that I think we need to redefine to fit our communities. And when Mr. Scott allowed us to come to his spring to get water to bring back to the school to wash for hand hygiene and to drink. Small gestures, but a gesture from the heart, which I interpret as being philanthropy, because the giving comes from the heart. When the men and women would come in and clean our floors and then put that oil on them so that the dust wouldn't rise up, they took care, they were good stewards of what God had blessed us with. When they made curtains or costumes for our plays, they were giving. So I think we look at philanthropy as being something big and grand, but it's not. It's a heart thing. And you give because you care and you want to uplift other people. So that's the first thing I think that we're learning through these webinars, that the partnerships are looking different, and so is the definition of philanthropy.
I would like to define, I love that what you said there, Muriel, and I also think philanthropy, I think I was trying to, in my statements, to help us think about philanthropy as the acknowledgement of, not, you can't give anybody human dignity, right? Because you're born with it. That's a gift from God. That's a gift from the eternal. But the acknowledgement of one's human dignity and capacity and their right to be is what I like to define philanthropy. So when you think about Rosenwald or Mr. Scott allowing you to get water, or that is because it starts with the acknowledgement of the dignity and the right to be from the others. And so philanthropy starts with that, and that out of that can be great riches, right? $40 million to, to a school in Chicago, that probably didn't need it, and $5 million to one that probably could have used the 40, should have been reversed. Just thinking about what just happened in Chicago, people applaud those gifts. But philanthropy is the recognition of that human dignity. And I think the Rosenwald methodology, right? It seems that there was this mindset, and Booker T. Washington certainly promoted this idea that dignity comes from within, and from doing the work yourself and participating and being involved in it as well. And so it doesn't take a lot. It takes just showing up and being fully present. And making the most and the best out of the situation. I was just on a webinar right before this where there was another rabbi who talked about the idea of enough. Diane, to have enough is really the principle that we need to uphold as we think about philanthropy.
I looked up just now what Merriam-Webster says about philanthropy, and interestingly, it says nothing necessarily about money. It's more than writing a check, which you all have said, as well as the rabbi, the good rabbi. It's about goodwill to fellow members of the human race, especially an active effort to promote human welfare. And so when we think about it, how are we being, in our present day, more narrow of thinking that it's about writing a check? Because from what the conversation has been so far, anyone can be a philanthropist. Anyone can do those good deeds as they live out their faith and their creed, whether they are whatever faith they believe, so that they are really ensuring that those 4 freedoms that Dr. Harris talked about, the freedom of to speak your mind, to worship however you please, the freedom from wanting and having, dire needs, the freedom of fear, to be able to walk in the streets without driving while, having a picnic while, or doing anything while, and you can fill in the blank from there. We know what that means. But being relieved from that fear is freedom. And that freedom is how humanity honors itself. And I think the Rosenwald schools were like seeds. I've been doing gardening lately, and I can see the seeds by 2 hands. One that is African-American that understands slavery, one that comes from the Jewish faith and who understands the challenges. This was even before the Holocaust when Rosenwald gave the money, but understood what it meant to deal with oppression, and for them to walk together and plant seeds for the next generation, that were more than the walls of the school, but it was about planting values that would be there from generation to generation to generation. So as I think about any questions that our panelists might have, so far we're doing pretty well. Any last comments, Dr. Harris or Muriel, that you'd like to share with the group? And what I'd like to do as we wrap up, and I really apologize for the video. I want people to see it in its entirety. I thought that we might show it toward the end so that those who want to stay on can watch the very beginning of it, because the video itself is a little more than 5 minutes in total. I want you to get the full effect while you're here with us. Anything else you all would like to share or say?
I guess the only thing I want to say is I was very excited to see the Pine Grove School on the as one of the most endangered historical sites in Virginia, and recognizing that school as an important place where very important community legacy. And I think that that's so critically important because it represents the reality that Black folk have contributed to their own betterment, to their own sense of community, to their own social and economic welfare, and that Black folk have not been always looking for a handout or ever really looking for a hand. We've always participated in the uplift of not only ourselves, but of others. And so to some degree, if you use a scale that's only about the finances, we haven't made the kind of wealth. But part of that is because we didn't always hoard it to ourselves. We shared our wealth, we shared what we could, and in spite of the oppressions and the all the very well documented ways in which Black folk and African American people were prevented from participating fully in the social and economic life of this country, but that it's not about, and I just really appreciate that it's not about money. It really is about heart and mind and soul, and showing up not only for God, but for one another. So and thank you for inviting me to be part of the conversation.
Okay. Ms. Muriel.
Yeah, that the word legacy keeps coming up. And I put that in the title of the webinar series, the legacy of the Black community, of Black communities and the Rosenwald School, because it seems as though our contributions are just being discovered. And so we're not diminishing the philanthropy, the contribution, the partnership of Julius Rosenwald. What we are doing is elevating our contributions, which may have been less tangible, to that same level, so that we have a full story of the Rosenwald. I think they ought to be Washington Rosenwald, because it was a partnership after all.
Very much
Yeah.
so. Very much
It was a partnership, from idea to funding. It was a partnership. So I'd like to see that Dr. Washington's name elevated in that too. But we've got a 100-year start or so here with the Rosenwald School. And like the rabbi said, we did not, this is not the way he wanted it, but because he was giving the lion's share of the money. Mm-hmm. Well, in some instances, Pine Grove received $50 out of the $1,550 to build the school. So it seems that it depended upon the community's will, desire, and ability to match those funds. So in so many ways, this was forward thinking and creative, and people had a sense of ownership. Communities had a sense of ownership. So that's our legacy. Our legacy is in sustaining the idea, sustaining the program, because without the Black contribution, they would have been buildings.
And they were more than buildings, they were edifices.
Yeah, exactly.
They were representations of values.
That's right.
Dr. Harris, Muriel Branch, and also I want to give recognition to the good rabbi. I want to thank you all for taking us on this journey. And I want to leave you with a quote that I am reminded of by my father, who you so graciously acknowledged, because it makes me think more about what you said in terms of it's not just about money. He said, quantity, think about money, is what you can count. But quality, think about values, is what you can count on. And I think lifting up the Rosenwald story, lifting up the partnerships, and lifting up the legacy of how all of us can lift each other up from generation to generation with what these buildings as edifices mean to our communities and how they have to be preserved. And kudos to all of you in your family and community for saving the school. I know it's not over, but saving your school, saving that history as a legacy to the next generation. Because if you don't know your past, you will never know who you are in the present or the future. So with that, I'd like to take a moment to try to do, if I can do share screen now, Sonia, and if I can go back and let me have my fingers crossed, because I sure don't want to do another bloop like I just did. And what I'm hoping is that as you, let's see, can you see my screen now? Okay, good. I'm going to end this wonderful webinar that was so well executed by our panelists with our encore presentation about the Rosenwald schools. Are you ready? And after this, we thank you and join us and continue to find out more about this amazing Pine Grove project.
They were called Rosenwald schools. Built between 1912 and 1937, they provided an opportunity for hundreds of thousands of poor African Americans to be educated in the segregated South. In fact, their construction has been called one of the most effective philanthropic endeavors of the 20th century. But the story of the schools and their benefactor remain largely unknown today. We traveled to Georgia last week to learn about the past and the impact of these institutions and what they're still having on us today.
From above, it seems ordinary, a simple white house an hour northwest of Atlanta. But when the Noble Hill School was constructed nearly 100 years ago, it was revolutionary.
This was my school. Before this, we weren't even allowed to be taught.
Marion Coleman and 4 generations of her family were educated here, one of thousands of schoolhouses built over 3 decades that transformed African American education in the rural South.
We weren't really free to do or to think that we could accomplish more. But when we were able to get the school, and this just made the foundation so that we could really believe in ourselves, and the teachers helped us to know that we were able to move forward now.
They became known as Rosenwald schools, named after wealthy industrialist Julius Rosenwald, the president of retail giant Sears.
This is an important Southern story. This is an important American story. This story transforms America.
Photographer Andrew Filer is telling that story in black and white. A story that grew out of a friendship between Rosenwald, the son of Jewish immigrants, and noted educator Booker T. Washington, founding president of the Tuskegee Institute.
From Tuskegee, the institute which he founded.
Together, they sought to reverse years of inequality in education because of slavery and segregation.
This story are the pillars of my life. The relationship between Julius Rosenwald and Booker T. Washington is the foundation of the Black-Jewish alliance that becomes a pillar of the civil rights movement.
In 1912, they launched a pilot program, building 6 schools in Alabama, requiring local communities to donate the land and raise matching funds.
What were they trying to defeat?
Schools started off as being segregated. They were trying to get through that part.
What does that do to a child?
Well, to me, that would dishearten them and give them make them feel like they didn't matter.
Within 25 years, 4,978 schools were built across 15 states. Buildings of basic design, 2 rooms with a removable partition, large windows to let in light, and a plain exterior to avoid unwanted attention.
These little schools had such a profound impact. Can you put it into words?
There are economists at the Federal Reserve Bank that have done 5 studies of Rosenwald schools. And what their analysis shows is that prior to World War I, there was a large and persistent black-white education gap in the South. That gap closes precipitously between World War I and World War II. And the single greatest driver of that achievement, and it is an achievement, is Rosenwald schools.
I think of our educational system today.
Yes.
I wonder what could be learned from a deeper dive into the Rosenwald history.
We often think that problems in America, public policy problems in America, are so intractable, particularly those related to race. At the center of this story is Julius Rosenwald and Booker T. Washington reaching across divides of race, religion, and region partnering with Black communities and white school boards to fundamentally change America.
Only about 500 schools remain, relics of a time before legal segregation ended in 1954. Some have been repurposed or rebuilt, but many are in disrepair, forgotten by the communities they served. Filer spent 3.5 years documenting them. His photographs are on display at the National Center for Civil and Human Rights in Atlanta, an effort to help preserve their legacy.
Why don't we know this?
Julius Rosenwald is a very modest man. He did not name these schools Rosenwald schools. They become known as Rosenwald schools. One of the reasons why we don't know the Rosenwald name as much as we know the names of some of his philanthropic contemporaries like Carnegie, Rockefeller, Ford.
They were monument builders.
They were.
He was a legacy builder.
Yes.
That legacy is still being felt. Many of those educated at Rosenwald schools went on to higher education and in turn educated future generations. And prominent leaders of the civil rights movement like Medgar Evers, Maya Angelou, and Congressman John Lewis came through these institutions. Today, Noble Hill is a museum run by Marion's niece, Valerie. Generations removed from the school, but steeped in its history.
It's not just African American history to us, it's also American history. This is not just a job for me, this is legacy.
It is such an amazing place to go and to see how a community has so embraced or re-embraced this school. I knew nothing about these schools.
Makes me want to visit Noble Hill.
I know. But there is a book that Filer put together, A Better Life for Their Children, the foreword written by John Lewis.
Oh, wow. So as you can see, there is an amazing history at Pine Grove. There's an amazing history that we have to move forward so that the legacy, particularly as Muriel Miller Branch has emphasized, is critical for us to move forward, not only with our present, but in the future in partnership with each other. Thank you all for a great evening tonight. Happy Juneteenth to you as you celebrate the first opportunity for us to have a national celebration for such an important event. There are plenty of Juneteenth activities in every community. Have a great day.